The train that never stops. I've always hated long commutes. The monotony of watching the same scenery fly by, the hum of the engine, and the muted conversations of strangers can become oppressive after a while. But work is work, and when I landed a job in a city 2 hours away from home, I resigned myself to the grind. Every weekday morning, I'd board the 6:45 a.m. train and spend the next 2 hours dozing off, reading, or staring out the window. It was a dull routine, but it paid the bills. That train, the number 1173, had been running the same route for decades. The tracks wound through dense forests, sleepy towns, and open fields before reaching the bustling city center. It wasn't fancy or fast, but it was reliable. At least that's what I thought. One Friday evening, everything changed. The day at work had been unusually long, and by the time I reached the station, the sun had already dipped below the horizon. The platform was nearly empty, the usual commuters having left on earlier trains. I checked the schedule. The last train of the night, 1173, was still set to depart at 9:15 p.m. I sighed with relief, grateful I hadn't missed it. When the train pulled into the station, it looked different. The familiar blue and white carriages were now a dull gray, as if the color had been leached out. The windows were darker than usual, reflecting the faint glow of the station lights rather than revealing the interior. I hesitated, but the conductor, a tall man in an old-fashioned uniform, waved me aboard. His face was shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, and I couldn't make out his features. "Last train," he said in a voice that carried no emotion. I nodded and stepped inside. The interior was colder than I expected, the air carrying a faint metallic tang. The lights flickered occasionally, casting the empty seats in an eerie glow. I walked down the aisle, my footsteps echoing in the silence, and chose a seat near the middle of the car. There were a few other passengers, silent figures scattered throughout the train, their faces obscured by shadows or turned away from me. As the train lurched forward, I tried to settle in. I pulled out my book, but the words seemed to swim on the page. The hum of the train was louder than usual, almost a low growl, and it made it hard to focus. I gave up and stared out the window instead. That's when I noticed something strange. The train wasn't following its usual route. The landscape outside was unfamiliar. Gone were the familiar suburban streets and small towns. Instead, the train was speeding through dense, twisted forests where the trees leaned unnaturally close to the tracks, their branches clawing at the sky. A thick fog rolled in, obscuring everything beyond a few feet from the window. I glanced around the car, expecting someone else to notice, but the other passengers remained silent and still. My phone had no signal, of course. I thought about getting up to find the conductor, but something about the other passengers made me hesitate. Their stillness was unnatural. None of them had moved since I'd boarded, and the more I looked, the stranger they seemed. One man sat with his head tilted at an odd angle, his face turned toward the window, but unseeing. A woman a few rows ahead of me had her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. I couldn't even tell if they were breathing. The train slowed, and for a moment, I felt relief. Maybe I'd get off at the next station, no matter where it was, and call for a ride home. But when the train stopped, my relief turned to dread. The platform was empty. No lights, no station name, nothing but an expanse of blackness stretching out in every direction. The fog was thicker here, swirling around the train like something alive. I strained to see through it, and for a moment, I thought I caught a glimpse of movement. Figures darting in and out of the mist, too fast to make out clearly. The doors didn't open. The train sat there for what felt like an eternity, and then it began moving again. Panic started to creep in. I stood and walked toward the nearest passenger, the woman with the clasped hands. "Excuse me," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the silent car. "Do you know what's going on?" She didn't respond. I moved closer, reaching out to tap her shoulder, but as soon as my fingers brushed her sleeve, she collapsed forward. I staggered back, horrified, as her body slumped lifelessly to the floor. Her skin was cold and pale, her eyes wide open but blank. I stumbled into the aisle, my heart pounding. The other passengers, what little I could see of them, remained unmoving. It was as though they hadn't noticed what had just happened, or maybe they couldn't. I made my way to the front of the car, determined to find the conductor. The door to the next car was heavy, and when I opened it, the cold air hit me like a wall. The car beyond was empty, its seats torn and stained, as though it hadn't been used in years. The lights flickered erratically, casting strange shadows that seemed to stretch and twist on their own. I kept moving, passing through car after car, each one more decrepit than the last. Some were filled with debris, broken furniture, shattered glass, even bones. I tried not to look too closely. Finally, I reached the conductor's cabin. The door was ajar, and inside the conductor stood with his back to me, his hands gripping the controls. The cabin's window showed nothing but blackness outside. "Where are we going?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The conductor didn't turn. "We're on the route," he said, his tone flat and hollow. "Just like always." "This isn't the route. Stop the train." He finally turned to face me and my breath caught in my throat. His face was wrong. The features were there, eyes, nose, mouth, but they were distorted, as though someone had painted a human face onto a warped canvas. His eyes were empty sockets, dark and endless. "You can't get off," he said. "Not now." I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up in a hospital bed. They told me I'd been found wandering near the tracks, miles away from any station. My clothes were torn, my hands scratched and bloody. No one could explain how I got there. When I tried to tell them about the train, they looked at me with pity. According to the transit authority, train 1173 hadn't run that night. In fact, it had been out of service for years. But I know what I saw, and sometimes late at night, I hear that low, growling hum outside my window, the sound of wheels on tracks calling me back.